Overcoming by purefoysgirl. Chapter 34. There were a million reasons to dissuade Hannibal and Will from carrying that kiss further, starting with the lack of locks on the washroom doors, or the proximity to their unexpected guest, or the unhelpful way in which the washroom seemed to amplify every tiny noise. But despite all that, despite everything that had happened, the kiss they shared deepened with every second. It was a catharsis of pent-up tension, of exhaustion. It was Hannibal spitting in the face of the gods again, resisting their attempts to cow him with devastation. He had come so close to losing Will, so very close. Yet Will was warm and very much alive in his lap, and Hannibal was alive to marvel over him, and all else could burn to a crisp in the heat of his desire to love his little mate. "What are you doing, Lord Clarges?" Will whispered, breaking the kiss. Hannibal's hand sliding from his hips to his bottom pierced the sensual haze overcoming him. They cupped him, squeezing, pulling Will closer to him. "Appreciating my mate," Hannibal breathed between Will's nibbling kisses. Their other encounters had been studied, cautious, exploratory, revelatory for them both. The sudden shift from seduction to intent took him by surprise. He hadn't expected Will to be so receptive, for his scent to deepen to something Hannibal wanted to roll in and lap from his skin. The intensity of his mate's responses left him awed but eager. Perhaps he wasn't the only one who had nearly lost someone important to them. The thought that Will might be growing in affection for him blazed into his heart, a well of hope springing up to quench the ever-present dread that Will would decide they should part. Will groped to put his cup down, sliding it haphazardly onto the tub-side tray with the bottle. He sat up and fished Hannibal's little glass from under the water where he had let it fall, without a care, in his eagerness to touch his husband. Hannibal feasted on the sight of him, drenched from his shoulders down, slender, sturdy body revealed in exquisite detail, shirt floating up to bare his trim waist. The back of his hair had dipped into the water where Hannibal had dragged him in. It dripped water down the length of his graceful throat, tiny drops like a scattering of diamonds on his pearly skin. It was what he couldn't see that drew him most, however. Will's brilliant mind, his vast and determined heart, the goodness that lay at his core that even his father had not been able to gut of him. The same goodness that had called him to danger time and again, always for others, always in defense of those who had no defense for themselves, even at the risk of snuffing his light out forever. He sat up and drew Will in for another kiss, hungry and needy, tongue plundering the hot depths of Will's mouth, and trying his sharp little teeth until Will drew back, gasping for breath, questions in his blue eyes. "Had I come a moment later?" Hannibal couldn't finish that sentence, couldn't finish the thought, and he didn't need to. Will cupped his face, shaken by his anguish, the care that gave birth to it. It was another confession hoarded, another breathless whisper to be held in his heart and nurtured. It slid down through him to find something deeper, teasing forth another thread that strengthened his bond to his husband. "You didn't," he whispered, kissing Hannibal's forehead, tipping his chin up and closing his eyes in bliss when Hannibal bit him there beneath his jaw, possessive and fearful and compelled to taste him. He ached for Hannibal to bite his throat again, to lay those sharp teeth to his skin and mark him, claiming him at long last. The shivering thought brought another flush to darken his skin, and sudden understanding came with it. The pieces of his own puzzle turned and neatly fell into place, and he knew without a doubt why he was so eager to encourage his husband into deeper intimacy. His heat was coming, the faintest brush of it like feathers on sensitive skin, slow and insidious, and tempting him closer to satisfying its demands. Hannibal purred and bit him, the sharp press of teeth pulling a breathless, soft moan from Will's plump lips. He gripped Hannibal's slick, smooth shoulders with both hands, muscle shifting beneath his fingers, all that raw power just waiting for his touch. Every inch of him radiated alpha strength, the bruises from his fight, badges of victory, marks that Will caressed with care, marveling that they were gained in defense of him. "Will," Hannibal whispered, lapping at his damp skin, dragging his fangs over Will's flesh to mouth beneath his jaw, sucking to draw more of his scent out. The heat in his groin was unbearable, not loosely filling as if anticipation alone was enough to bid it to rise. The only other time he'd been so unbearably roused was during his rut, and a part of him wondered if his nearness to his enticing husband had triggered it after all these years. "You taste like heaven," he moaned, forsaking the thought for the pleasure of feeling his mate through every sense, fragrance of flesh, quivering of muscle, unsteady rush of his breath as he panted, the flavor of his skin, the sight of him flushed and feverish with desire. What hope did nature herself have in the face of such bounty? She could take her course as she pleased, so long as Will would kiss him. "Heaven tastes like soap?" Will asked, a soft laugh biting off on a gasp when Hannibal squeezed him close, rearing up between his legs in incessant heat, the washcloth long gone. "Hannibal, we shouldn't." Hannibal gave him one last suck and lifted his head, laving his tongue over Will's lips. He gave Will's perfect backside another lingering caress and slid his hand to his hips, thumbs brushing absent circles over hip bones beneath the cloudy water. "Abigail is just there," Will said, wondering which of them he was trying to convince. "She's sleeping," Hannibal whispered, trailing his tongue up to Will's ear to nibble him. Will tipped his head, the sweet ache in his groin even deeper, a live coal being blown into a flame in his belly. "What if we wake her?" Hannibal kissed him again, coaxing Will's tongue with his own, teasing him, hands hot and firm against Will's hips. "We'll be quiet," he breathed, nipping Will's plump lower lip, head tipping to fit his mate's mouth in perfect union. "I don't believe you," Will told him, refusing to look down, but closing his eyes only made him all the more aware of that hot flesh pumping up between the press of their bellies, swollen and twitching. His own body thrummed to reach it, fighting the confines of his wet clothing in a titillating rub of fabric over delicate skin. "You're very irresistible," Hannibal supplied, rolling his hips just a fraction to press harder between Will's marvelous thighs. "Flawless in my seduction." "Vocal!" "You're right. We should just finish our bath." "Yes," Will agreed, disappointed to let logic win. It was for the best, however, considering how little inhibition he could muster in regards to his husband. At least now he knew why, though it left him feeling hollow to think it was all a heat-induced construction. It frustrated him to doubt himself, that he could not simply enjoy Hannibal's attentions as a shared delight instead of as something their respective biologies might be pushing them toward. Hannibal loosened his hold on Will, turning him to settle between his spread thighs. Will shifted with him, coming to rest with Hannibal's sex pressing insistently against his lower back, cradled by his husband's body in the warm, sweetly scented water. Hannibal tugged Will to rest against his broad, furry chest, and plucked up the bar of soap, working up a thick lather between his hands. Will watched with a throb of anticipation as Hannibal's soapy hands dropped to cup his chest, drawing the wet shirt taut over large, dark nipples. They stiffened instantly, aching and tight, and he dropped his head back, unable to watch when Hannibal began to rub his soapy hands in a slow massage over his chest. "Is this finishing our bath?" Will whispered, thighs spreading to ease the pressure in his groin, the confines of his pants almost unbearable. "It is," Hannibal purred, teasing his tongue into Will's ear. He caught Will's nipples between spread fingers and pinched lightly with each pass, tugging them as he soaped Will's chest. "You washed my back after all. I'm just returning the favor." Will shivered, relishing each pass of Hannibal's palms over his chest, biting his lips against a moan when he used his fingertips to tease Will's nipples to stiff fullness through his sodden shirt. He could feel his slumberous heat awakening, roused by his husband's touches, but Will couldn't stop him. He didn't want to stop him. If anything, he wanted to wiggle free of his clothes and let Hannibal's hands travel wherever they liked, outside and in. "May I touch you, Will?" Hannibal breathed, suckling on his earlobe, heavy sex thrumming just at the suggestion. There was a gentle tease to his tone when he promised. "I swear I won't look." Will laughed, soft and breathless, back arching in rhythm with each slick brush and pull of Hannibal's fingers on him. He ached to be suckled, to feel Hannibal's sharp teeth testing the hardened tips of his chest, and sucking away the sting. He knew well enough what Hannibal could wring from him through his clothing, and the thought of his soap-slick hands even lower sent a bolt of anticipation through him. Trembling, he fumbled in the water to undo the fastenings of his pants, eyes closed, silent invitation for Hannibal to touch him without the barrier of cloth between them. "Well," Hannibal moaned, folding one arm around him to hold him close while his other hand trailed down Will's fluttering belly. His eyes swept closed, his senses focusing down on the way Will's muscles tensed beneath his fingertips, the way the water grew more heated as he reached down. He found him there, hot and pulsing, a firm length that pushed up into his palm through his thin underthings. For a split second, Hannibal imagined feeling him through that lace and silk bodysuit, and he shuddered hard, hips rocking in a short, fierce arch against Will's warm weight. "I never thought I could feel this. I touch you and I think I will lose my mind from it, but instead I find my reason." "Your reason for what?" Will asked, breathless and tense as Hannibal's fingers slid beneath the lip of his underthings. Those sensitive, seeking fingertips brushed his bared, hot head. The same moment Hannibal whispered, "For being." Will arched into his hand, biting his lip to hold in the cry that threatened to break from him. He tried to sit up, to contain the fearsome, overwhelming sensation of bare skin sliding over his sensitive sex. Hannibal moved with him, an encompassing strength, shelter in the storm, hot and tight against his body from shoulders to thighs. He cradled Will when he subsided, purring into his ear soft encouragement, peppering him with kisses as he took him in hand. The soap wore away very quickly in the water, but Hannibal's gentle touch was a little better than a milking squeeze, working Will's aching head and venturing no lower, respectful of the limitations he'd been given. Hannibal was overwhelmingly delighted that Will allowed this much, and marveled at how he felt. He was silky and firm, his skin so fragile that Hannibal scarcely moved his hand for fear of hurting him. He imagined Will would be pink there, a delicate blush like the lining of a shell, deepened to ruddy red from friction. "Your skin is so soft," he whispered, relishing Will's panting breaths, short and sharp and indicative of pleasure. "So smooth and hot in my hand." Will's cheeks pinked up, but his body gave a lusty pulse, betraying the effect it had on him. His round bottom pushed back an almost painful pressure against Hannibal's loose knot and stiff flesh. "Some day, Will, I hope to find out that the rest of you is just as soft and smooth and hot." "Hannibal," Will said, his name broken off by a tight clench of teeth as Will tightened, too new to this pleasure to last long beneath Hannibal's enthusiastic touch. The squeeze of Hannibal's calloused hand was maddening, a shocking explosion of sensation that couldn't be contained. "Especially inside," Hannibal murmured, shuddering in time with Will as his pleasure broke with force. His slim hips arched against Hannibal's hand, rocking, and Hannibal drew back with Will in the cup of his groin, his hand gently milking Will's orgasm from him in racking pulses. It was too much to withstand, the rocking pressure of his mate's plump backside wriggling against him, coupled with the bliss of bringing him to such a state. It was half pain with the friction of the cloth between them, but it overcame him all the same, gasping in awe as his release spilled out of him in bursts of breathless sensation. Will gripped the sides of the tub so hard his knuckles blanched white, each breath burning from the effort of keeping quiet as his body peaked and peaked again, greedy for pleasure it had too long been denied. He felt Hannibal's hard sex beneath him, felt the veins pulsing in response to his climax, and the quiver that ran through him. He rocked with each squeeze of Hannibal's hand around him, his slick entrance hot and waiting, pressed tight to his husband's heavy, throbbing sex. It didn't feel like his heat coloring his judgment when he wanted it inside him, spearing him open and filling him full, Hannibal's intimidating knot tying them tight into pleasure. It felt like something he needed, something they both needed, the next natural step for two people in love. He shuddered, the force of his orgasm chasing that unexpected thought away. He slowly relaxed, letting his full weight rest on his husband's hips as he caught his breath. Hannibal gave him another squeeze to make his breath stutter, and trailed his fingers down Will's sex to cup him before sliding back up to his belly. Hannibal shifted to draw Will back down into the water, eyes closed in exquisite pleasure to feel Will's entrance press to him like a hot little ember. He relished the beauty of it, the joy of giving his mate so much pleasure, a much-needed reprieve from a day too filled with darkness and terror. He wanted to chase it all away, to fill Will so full of him that his beautiful mate would dream of being in his arms and not be plagued by nightmares of how things might have gone wrong. "You beautiful, amazing wonder," he said, urging Will to turn in his arms, to kiss him, to lay close in the water kept hot by their need for each other. "You priceless, reckless, brilliant man." Will's panting slowed, the sharpness of it fading to a throb as he slumped against his husband, pleasantly spent and tender in the aftermath. Hannibal's praise went straight to his heart, vulnerable as it always was when they were so close and so intimate with one another. It was a balm to old words spoken and unable to be taken back. Acceptance and awe, tenderness and affection, whispered admissions of absolute truth that resonated through their bond. "My uncommon and unstoppable wolf," Hannibal whispered, water sloshing over the tub rim as he pulled Will high in his arms to nestle against his broad chest. "1,000 years of praises would hardly touch the treasure that you are to me, Will." Will tipped his head up, his looming heat calming somewhat, but still there, still lurking beneath the surface, an unpredictable and unwelcome complication that Will wasn't sure he was ready to deal with, or even how to approach it now. He kissed his husband instead, a much more pleasant action, a slight shift bringing his muscular thigh up between Hannibal's legs. Through their slow, lingering tangle of tongues, of lips, he became aware of the firmness resting against his thigh, and when they came up for air he angled a look at his husband, brows up. "I may have gotten a little overwhelmed," Hannibal said, his swollen knot pressing to Will's lovely thigh. "Feeling you come apart from me quite did me in, I'm afraid. In my defense, you do have an uncanny habit of undoing me entirely." It was said with a lopsided grin, so full of affection and indulgence that Will kissed him again, needing to rely on it, to rely on the unspoken promise Hannibal made with every tender word, every gentle gesture, every protestation of devotion. "At least it wasn't my knee." "Nonsense, of course it was. And your incredible thighs, and your perfect bottom." Will kissed him again, but Hannibal plowed ahead, murmuring between kisses, "And your lower lip is really very dangerous, Will, not to mention those graceful hands of yours. How can a man hope to keep his wit when your waist dips so perfectly into your hips? Aphrodite must weep with jealousy when she catches sight of your calves." The kiss was working up to another little bonfire, feeding when a firm knock came at the door, startling them both. They broke apart, and Hannibal breathed. "I'm going to fire everyone next time we are interrupted." "You won't either." "Yes." "Magistrate Crawford is downstairs, my lords," Jimmy said, sounding positively gleeful that they were both inside the washroom together. "Should I tell him you're otherwise occupied?" "Yes." "No, Jimmy, tell him we'll be down in a little while," Will corrected, slipping out of Hannibal's hold. "And if you could fetch a change of clothing for me, including boots?" "I certainly can. Including boots, my lord." "Cheeky," Hannibal growled, his eyes drawn to Will's backside as he exited the tub, pants clinging to every delectable curve. "He's wonderful, and you know it," Will said, stepping carefully down the slick, wet floor. "Such a mess we've made in here, I feel terrible." "Not as terrible as I feel now," Hannibal sighed, reaching for a bathing sheet to cover himself as he rose and stepped out of the tub. "Our servants exist to plague me. How can we be so consistently interrupted at such inopportune times?" "How you do go on," Will laughed, turning to tuck the end of the sheet up in the lip to keep Hannibal decently covered, though the enormity of his renewed appreciation made that difficult, as Will's traitorous eyes kept confirming for themselves. Hannibal captured his hand and kissed his knuckles, then his fingertips, before drawing Will's finger into his mouth for a soft suck, lids drooping to hood his eyes in an expression of perfect, blissful delight. "I don't think you're helping your particular situation," Will whispered, wiggling his fingers against Hannibal's tongue, half encouragement. He plucked his hand away, feeling another rush of warmth into his belly, a sensual warning not to continue. "I don't appear to be helping yours either," Hannibal said, smirking when Will took his meaning. His mate's scent seemed delightfully strong for having just been submerged. Hannibal was certain something was changing in him, considering how faint his scent had always been before. Inspired that he might find out for himself the reason why it was, he suggested, "We should sort this out before we go downstairs." "There isn't time," Will reminded him, the tug and pull of his wet clothing a pleasurable torture against his sensitive skin. He didn't have to glance down to know how stark and hard his nipples were against his wet white shirt, or how obvious the bulge of his sex was through his wet pants. Hannibal was doing enough ogling for the both of them. "We have to go downstairs." "Well, I can't go in this state," Hannibal pointed out, a little impressed with himself. It certainly did feel like his rut was approaching. That, or Will just roused his libido with unheard-of speed, which he felt was entirely likely. Will considered it for a moment, despite how dangerous it was with his heat rearing its ugly head. Wishing it could have been otherwise, he said, "I suppose I'll have to do something about it, then." Hannibal's brows rose, a slight smile curving his mouth as Will stepped closer. His heart picked up its pace, thundering in his chest, fit to defeat him. It pounded even harder when Will stopped before him, barely brushing him, and tipped his beautiful face to breathe into his ear. "Imagine Aunt Margaret just walked in." "Will!" Hannibal scrambled backwards, hands crossed protectively over his groin, an expression of such utter betrayal and horror on his face that Will couldn't keep from chuckling. "I am very glad you find this amusing." "I do. Did it work?" "Perhaps too well," Hannibal lamented, his glare not half as fierce as he would have liked. "I might never recover from the shock." "That would truly be a shame, since I imagine we'll be sharing a bed again at some point, or a tub." It had the desired effect of replacing betrayal with hope, and Will warned him. "Don't think about it too much, or I'll have to mention—" "Don't!" Hannibal warned, holding up a staying hand. "Thank you very much, but that was quite enough to do the job, Will." "Then if you'll excuse me, I'm going to wait for Jimmy and change. You'll need to exit the washroom, Lord Clarges." "Don't go down alone, Will," Hannibal called, all bantering aside for now. "I have a feeling Jack's visit will be in no way pleasant. We should be together for it." "Of course, Hannibal," Will said, relieved on that count, and shooed his sheet-wrapped husband out into his bedroom. Magistrate Crawford stalked the modest parlour of Marsham Heath like a caged bear, lumbering but powerful, with a glower that even old Thatcher raised a brow at. "How did you know?" he asked, pinning Will with his glittering dark eyes the moment the two of them passed through the doorway. "Magistrate," Hannibal said, taking a step forward when Will tensed. "How did you know?" He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. No softness could hide the measured authority in Jack Crawford, the expectation for instant obedience, be it constable or lord before him. "Magistrate Crawford, might I suggest we sit?" Hannibal offered, giving Will time to order his thoughts. He moved to the little sidebar where Mr. Thatcher had thoughtfully provided some fortification, and poured Jack a measure. "I prefer to stand," Jack said, still watching Will. "I also prefer my questions to be answered when I ask them." Will squared his shoulders, chin tipping up as he faced Magistrate Crawford. "It made sense," he said, his hands loose at his sides, reaching for the calm that had never failed him, not in the face of his father's temper, and certainly not in the face of Magistrate Crawford's unnerved disbelief. "You're telling me the bodies of 3 of our missing girls being strung up in the Hobbs' smokehouse somehow made sense to you?" Jack asked, the last words holding a bite. "Magistrate," Hannibal said, a mild warning as he handed Jack the glass. "You're in our house, and my mate is willing to answer your questions. I would appreciate it if you would be cognizant that you are a guest in our home." Jack blew out a deep breath, the tension ebbing from his broad shoulders. "I apologize, Lord Clarges, if I seem abrasive." "There's no need to apologize, Magistrate Crawford. I understand you're bearing up beneath a good deal of stress. It takes a strong man to do so, especially considering what you've seen. There's little time for niceties with so many unanswered questions." Jack lowered his cup, eyebrows lifting. He caught a glance at Hannibal, who had poured a drink for himself and Will, and said, "You're right, Lord Clarges. His perception is uncanny." "He sees a good deal," Hannibal said, tipping his glass to Will. "It is my advice to never underestimate him." Will gave him a taut smile and took the drink, though he did not drink it. "Out there in the woods," Jack said, pondering. "Something fell into place for you, didn't it? What was it? How did you know he was eating them?" "The bite marks," Will said, struggling to piece that moment together in a way that would make sense to someone not privy to his thoughts. Hannibal's hand brushed down his spine, a soothing caress that settled him and woke a sheen of sweat over his shoulders. "When Hannibal pointed them out, I realized what he was doing." "That's a big leap, Lord Clarges," Jack said, putting his glass down carefully, aware of his own strength with something so delicate. "That could have been part of an assault, even a large animal. You said yourself there was no prey left, no large predators." Hannibal reminded him, feeling Will's temperature spike beneath his touch, warm enough that it had to be uncomfortable for him. Yet his smokehouse ran day and night. Will's blue eyes were sorrowful when they met Jack's, welling with too much understanding, too many pieces to too many puzzles, until the world was a confusing jumble of too much. Where did the meat come from? Jack looked away, mouth bowed down in a frown. Will wondered how many slabs of smoked meat the Crawfords had purchased from the Hobbs family in the past, and decided he didn't need to know. Imagining it was bad enough. I never would have thought of such a thing, Jack admitted, swallowing hard. I should have guessed. I should have known. There was no way to know, Hannibal said, sensing his rising agitation. He did, Jack said, angling his head toward Will. I'm magistrate of this town, Lord Clarges. The safety of these people is my responsibility. I should have questioned why there were 6 padlocks on the smokehouse that ran when no one ever made a kill. Do you know how long those tanning racks sat empty? How there was meat without skins? I should have known. There's no use berating yourself for something that you cannot go back and change. I imagine once the town realizes what has happened, there will be quite enough chaos for you to not go borrowing trouble with regrets, Magistrate. Have you found him? Hannibal asked, sliding his hand from Will's back to his side, fingers spreading to curve over his hip. No. He's a woodsman. He knows these forests better than anyone. We've brought in dogs, but he'll know how to confound them. It's a pity you weren't able to disable him, Lord Clarges. Believe me, Magistrate, I have my own regrets from our situation, Hannibal said, fingers tightening on Will in an unconscious response to a remembered threat. The image of them clashing welled up behind Will's closed lids. Hannibal in fighting fury, and the way his earthy scent had deepened to sharp, burning cedar and musk. He shuddered, the memory of that fight more vivid to him than the moment itself, distracted as he'd been. He felt another flush overcome him, the visceral bloom of his heat reaching to his alpha's display of dominance. But the real question is why, Jack said, his voice falling to a whisper of horror, confusion evident on his face. Why would he do this? Why would he seek to destroy the children of people he knew? People who had befriended him, been his neighbors all these years. Why would he turn on his wife and little girl? Because she's his, Will said, leaning into Hannibal's touch, needing all the comfort he could get. Abigail is his, but everyone knew the truth. Hobbs is a barren alpha, pushed and pushed to make others in his image, but unable to. So he made them his own. He had to prove it. He had to show everyone that they're his. But he couldn't bear to lose Abigail. He couldn't stand the idea of it. His voice grew faint as he wandered into the mind of Garrett Jacob Hobbs, making sense of something others would only find grotesque and disturbing. She's grown now. She started asking questions. She was going to leave him, and he couldn't stand for it. He had to kill her. He had to eat her. Jack's eyes widened, and he shook his head, brows drawn together in confusion. He eats them so he can keep them with him always. They're all his daughters, but they weren't good enough. The other girls. They were substitutes for Abigail. He killed them so he wouldn't kill her. But then we inadvertently escalated the situation by meeting with Louise Hobbs. I don't understand, Jack said, looking from Will to Hannibal. Abigail seems to be under the impression that I am her father, Hannibal said, noting how Jack drew up in surprise. We met with Louise to clarify the truth, and it seems Mr. Hobbs grew frightened upon her return. His fear of losing Abigail prompted him to keep her in the most permanent manner he could, Will said, looking aside, thinking of Louise and what she had sacrificed. Mrs. Hobbs, as any good and dedicated mother, died trying to save her daughter mere moments before we could arrive. Pardon my prying, my lords, but is she your daughter? Will drew a touch closer to Hannibal, the two of them presenting a unified front as Hannibal said, She is now. Come again. I have written to the capital, Will said, Hannibal's hands a burning brand of pressure against his side. We are applying for guardianship of Abigail Hobbs. I must respectfully refuse to support this decision. On what grounds? On the grounds that Miss Hobbs might have been privy to her father's activities. She lived in that house. She can't have remained ignorant of what was happening. Jack, that is absolutely vulgar, Hannibal said, wrinkling his nose in disgust. And possible, Jack said, which Hannibal couldn't deny. Excuse me, gentlemen, Will said, stepping away from Hannibal's touch to put his glass down, his cheeks flushed and his eyes glassy. He looked feverish enough that Hannibal searched his face in concern. Are you unwell? He asked, Will's stronger, sharper scent playing havoc with his senses, his pulse picking up and his skin tightening in response. Only in that I refuse to be party to a conversation where a child is being blamed for her father's crimes. Abigail Hobbs might now be dead. That she is alive is a miracle my husband has managed to perform. I can assure you I will not let her life be dictated once again by another man in a position of power over her. Good evening. He did not slam the door behind him, but Hannibal knew he wouldn't. The angrier Will was, the more careful he became, the more barbed his words were, and the more cutting his observations. My husband makes an excellent point, Hannibal said, abandoning his drink, and that Abigail's complicity in her father's crimes is moot. Complicity is never a moot point. If she helped him, then I am positive she did not do so by choice, which is precisely what my husband realizes. Hobbs was dangerous, clearly violent. If Abigail had any hand in what was happening, may have been due to her fear of being harmed. He certainly didn't hesitate to hurt her. He nearly sliced her throat. Those are not the actions of a loving father. No, but they are the actions of a man eliminating his accomplice, Jack said, dogged in his determination. Or a witness, Hannibal suggested. Jack subsided, aggravated and uneasy again, with no one to punish for the murders that had occurred. I want to speak to her. That isn't possible. She is suffering from a very serious injury and is heavily sedated. Tomorrow, then, Jack. I didn't save Abigail's life to watch her hang in her father's place. Jack subsided, but it was clear he would not let the issue drop. The lives of those girls will be remembered. Their families will have the peace of knowing justice was served when Hobbs dangles at the end of a rope for what he has done, or else is killed by one of your men. Abigail. Jack, haven't enough children died in Mosley? Jack considered him for a long, silent moment before he quietly asked, Can you live with her being a killer, Lord Clarges? Hannibal frowned. I have learned, Jack, that it is far easier to sit in judgment of something you have no understanding of than it is to see the world through another's eyes. I will do my best to see the world through Abigail's and help her find her way out of the dark woods her father has hidden her in. I can help her find her way forward. That is something I can live with, Jack. I certainly hope so, Jack said, his eyes flicking upward as if seeking her out through the floor. And I certainly hope that if she is a killer, you don't find out the hard way by losing one of your own children, Lord Clarges. God knows Mosley has lost enough for us all. Will was trembling by the time he got upstairs, and let himself into his suite to check on Abigail, still flushed with irritation at Jack's suggestion. One of the housemaids was sitting beside Abigail, working on some darning in a bedside chair with Winston curled up at her feet. She began to stand when he entered, but Will stayed her with a gesture, moving to block Winston from sniffing him. Has she stirred? Will asked, looking at Abigail's sleep-slackened face. He didn't envy what she faced when she finally woke, but he was determined he and Hannibal would help her recover from her losses. Jack Crawford wasn't going to punish her for her father's sins. Abigail Hobbs had survived against all odds, and she deserved to have a chance to live without another threat hanging over her head. Not a bit, my lord, but we turned her some, as his lordship said. Good, Will said, relieved. He pushed Winston's nose down again with a sharp look that quelled the dog's curiosity. He felt another wash of warmth on him, his skin sheening in sweat, clothes suddenly too small and itchy. He tugged at his neckerchief and moved to ring for Jimmy, telling her, Thank you, Emily. Please continue as you were. He took Winston and went out into the landing to catch Jimmy on his way up. Night was falling, the sky a ruby red, fading to dark velveteen blue beyond the hallway window. Another day closing, another night ahead, and a weighty decision on his head that he did not feel able to make alone. Light appeared at the far end of the hall, Jimmy Price carrying a little lamp to pick his way through the darkness and the residual mess the workers had left behind. He caught sight of Will and said, "My lord, what on earth are you doing out here? Hello, Winston."
"Jimmy," Will said and hesitated. He moved to Hannibal's door and opened it, saying, "I'm having a bit of a crisis and I need your help."
"Oh, my lord, you know how handy I am in a crisis," Jimmy said, following him inside and lighting lamps as he went, turning them up to fend off the darkness. "Now, what can I do for you?"
Will swiped at his forehead, shifting and uncomfortable in his heavy clothing. Jimmy turned when he didn't get a response, and his smile faded.
"Oh,"
he said, putting the lamp down in an empty bracket. He went to the washroom and wet a cloth, wringing it out. He brought it to Will, who slumped down on Hannibal's bed with a sigh. "Thank you," Will said, pressing it to his face and drawing a deep breath, a shudder overtaking him. He wiped his face with one hand, unresisting as Jimmy began to undo his buttons. "I should have realized it was happening. I've been so snappish and impulsive. Shouldn't have taken me by surprise."
"With so much going on, my lord," Jimmy said, his smile putting Will at ease, "I'm not surprised. Close calls have a tendency to make us want some reassurance, after all. Your ordeal today just pushed you when you weren't expecting it."
Jimmy stripped him down to his shirt and loosened his cuffs and collar before stepping back to tend to his clothes. Will wiped his feverish skin, mind shying away from the memories of Hannibal rising to his defense, from the tub and his soft words. Every moment of quiet, shared pleasure returned to plague him, stoking a fire in his belly that nothing could quench except his mate. Jimmy went through the washroom into Will's suite, quietly so as not to disturb Abigail's rest, and when he returned he had Will's nightclothes and dressing gown in hand. "Thank you, Jimmy," Will breathed, tipping his head back at the sensation of cool air on his skin when he shed his clothes. The valet gave him a prompt, professional wipe-down with a cool cloth to chase his sweat away before dressing him. The nightshirt was light as air as Jimmy eased it over his head, falling nearly to his calves. The dressing gown quickly covered it, tied it with precise snugness. Will declined the house shoes, spreading his toes against the woven rug and testing the texture on his skin. That accomplished, Jimmy began to pick up, saying,
"Don't worry, my lord. We're never unprepared. Mr. Thatcher has assured me the house stands at the ready to keep you in comfort during your time."
"You inquired?"
Will asked, uncertain if he should feel relieved or appalled. "Naturally. I could hardly serve you at my best if I'm caught unawares. Both the Duke and Duchess suites are proof for sound, so you needn't worry for privacy. It'll take me no time at all to prep the bed."
"Jimmy, I can't turn Hannibal out of his own bed."
"Beg your pardon?" Jimmy asked, shaking his head, confusion creeping into his smile. "I'm sorry to pry, my lord, but I assumed you would be spending this time with your husband."
"We've never discussed it. I had hoped we would be back at Hartford at the time where I could handle this quietly without his knowing. This is an unexpected complication."
"Do you want to spend your heat with him?"
Jimmy asked, trying to understand. "I think under other circumstances I would," Will said, sitting down on the bed to stroke Winston, who whined with unease. "Since his return, Hannibal has been everything I've ever dreamed of in a mate. Sharing this time with him should be something precious." He thought of Hannibal holding him, marking him, purring with pleasure just to touch him and be touched in return. They came together with urgency and awe. Surely not all of that was nature making him foolish. "I want to be with him," Will said, barely able to speak it aloud. He took a deep breath, a shudder coursing through him when he considered the implications. "I think of what we've shared so far, the things we've done, and then I think of the heats I've had."
"You fear it will change how he sees you," Jimmy said, his sympathy and understanding bringing tears to Will's eyes.
"He thinks I'm a treasure," Will said, smiling as he thought of his husband's murmured praise. "As silly as that sounds to say. He calls me brilliant, Jimmy. He says such incredible things to me, and he means them. He means them." He turned his head to look at his longtime friend and asked in a whisper, "What if my heat makes him see something he cannot accept? Something repulsive, sickening? What if he realizes that what he thinks I am isn't true? He says I am myself, and that is all I need to be, but there is every possibility that my growing heat has been clouding his vision of me all this time."
"Lord Clarges, it doesn't work that way."
Will stilled, confusion shrouding him, his hand falling still in Winston's ruff.
"Listen,"
Jimmy said, his tone capturing Will's full attention. "I can't claim to know what you were told, but I do know it was very little. I had hoped these past years you would learn through heats you experience that it doesn't make you some kind of mindless doll. It isn't just some type of lust potion that addles alpha brains." Jimmy reached out and grasped his hand, holding it firmly, earnest when he said, "My lord, what nature has given you is a gift meant to be shared, not a yoke meant to bind either one of you. I hate to think that you were so disturbed by something that was intended to honor you." It calmed Will's nerves somewhat, gave him a tiny corner from which to fortify himself and reach for objectivity. "I have seen a thing or two in my time, Lord Clarges," Jimmy said, smiling at him with fond affection. "But I can honestly say, I have never seen a man look at his spouse the way Lord Clarges looks at you." Will smiled, squeezing Jimmy's hand in return, still stroking Winston's fuzzy ears. "It's your decision," Jimmy said, letting him go to pat the clothes on his arms. "Would you like me to make up the room? A few of the girls are still here. We can have the bedding tended in a trice."
"Yes, Jimmy, thank you."
Will retreated to sit near the fire with Winston while the bed was made up, glistening with sweat as the oilcloth was put down to spare the mattress proper, then covered with a downy pad before the bed was remade with clean sheets and blankets. He thought of himself in that bed, bared to Hannibal's eyes, finally waltzing the dance nature had invented so long ago. Another flush washed over him, the throb of his heat growing stronger, a second heartbeat in his belly ripe with promise. His bond to Hannibal was like a warm coil of flesh around him, pulsing with strength that urged his heat to rise with every breath. "There we are," Jimmy said, behaving with routine efficiency, his focus on taking care of his charge. He shooed the maids out and came to Will, telling him, "I'll have cook make up a tray for your dinner, and I'll be up in a little while with some cold water for you. You just get comfortable, my lord. Let us take care of you."
"Thank you, Jimmy,"
Will said, shivering. He smiled when Jimmy impulsively leaned down and hugged him. "It's going to be okay, my lord," he said, drawing back to pat his cheek. "You deserve to be happy. We all want that for you more than anything."
"Thank you, Jimmy,"
Will said again, moved by his valet's dedication. "I'll just take this fellow here," Jimmy said, moving to grasp Winston's collar, "so he won't be a nuisance. He can bed down with one of the stable lads for a spell. Ring me when you need me, my lord. I'll have the kitchen staff keep the boilers fired so you can bathe when you need to." He left then, taking Winston with him to leave Will alone with his thoughts, shivering and too hot as his heat gained momentum. Will got to his feet, the familiar weight in his nethers dragging at him as he stood. He tried to drown himself in memories of Hannibal's smile, in his gentle touch, in his words and promises to make it up to him, all of it, to erase the pain of their past as if it had never been. This could heal so many old wounds coming together as they longed to do. It hurt him, his yearning for his Alpha, a physical pain. Everything in him urged him to rely on his husband, to trust that the awe in his touch was the truth, that the hunger which gripped Hannibal and made him greedy for Will was as unspoiled and spontaneous as Will's own growing desire to connect to his husband in every imaginable way.
"Weak and needy and only good for whorehouses."
Hannibal's words were a whisper from their past, a quiet and insidious doubt reaching up from the darkest part of Will's memories. They returned to him in his father's voice, mocking and cruel and fierce for their certainty. Memories of 6 years ago warned him to caution, begging him to step away from the cliff's edge and the plunge it promised. Will pushed those thoughts away, but they niggled at his resolve, drawing on his doubts. He imagined Jimmy downstairs on his way to the stables, relaying the situation in low tones to Mr. Berger. He imagined Berger waiting for the magistrate to leave, nervous to unburden himself to the man he had served for so long. He had a long wait on his hands, he knew, before Hannibal would arrive. He moved to the window to distract himself, looking out where the night had fallen to pure darkness. Stars had emerged from their shy repose, burying themselves in their glory, without fear or shame. He wished he could be so bold, wished the spirit of the courtier would reclaim him and allow him to shuck off this strange unease like a robe of chains. It would be so easy, he knew, just fling his inhibitions to the wind, shed his clothing like so much unwanted weight, and throw his arms wide for his husband, and be the whore he once called you. Will flinched again at the image that came with the thought, all the respect and regard that Hannibal had gained for him slowly leaching away to horror. Will shoved the window pane open, allowing a cool breeze to flow in, and closed his eyes as it played over his damp skin, all imaginings of sharing that bed with Hannibal as a married couple, smothered beneath heat-fueled nerves. Perhaps it would be best if he didn't inconvenience his husband with something neither of them was comfortable with. Hannibal's willingness to be loving toward him was not permission to embroil him in Will's heat. His desire for Will did not preclude the possibility that something so Megan might be too kin to his previously held beliefs for his comfort. It would be best for them both not to suffer through this ugliness together. There had been ample opportunities for Hannibal to discreetly make it known that he would like to be involved in Will's heat, but he had never mentioned it, as if such a possibility didn't exist. It was possible that if it was something that still disgusted him, the idea of it so unsavory that he could not bring himself to discuss it. There was every chance that Hannibal would be relieved by his decision, glad that Will was not an Omega who demanded his attention, that Will would not reduce him to nothing more than a stud to service a broodmare, as his father had always deemed such things. The only way for either one of them to emerge from this with their dignity intact was to pretend it wasn't happening. When Hannibal came to him, he could explain himself, and other arrangements could be made. They could move past the next few days and pick up where they left off, with Hannibal's understanding of him unsullied by the sordid truth his father had always known was there. He would spend his heat alone, as he had the others. It would be quiet, it would be routine, it would be lonely, as it always was. "Stop!" he hissed, clenching his teeth. His flushed skin broke out in another fine sweat, warning him that this heat would be much more aggressive than any he'd held before it. Perhaps even more aggressive than his first, much as he shuddered to think of it. Hannibal's image came to him unbidden along with the sense memory of his alpha scent. Will knew Hannibal had been responding to his heat without realizing it, his own alpha pheromone strengthening in reaction, a cycle of pressure neither one of them was aware of. "It doesn't matter," Will whispered to himself, closing his eyes against the memory of Hannibal's patrician, handsome face and amused smile. His heart raced despite it, his breath coming in short bursts as his body softened and grew wet in anticipation of something Will knew it would not be getting. "It's just touch hunger, that's all. It will fade. All of it will fade." Determined, Will squared his shoulders and returned to the door, sliding the latch into place. It was token, he knew. Hannibal could easily let himself in through their shared washroom to reach him. But he wouldn't do that. He would respect Will's intention. He would listen with his usual attentiveness, accept Will's decision, and leave for the capital, perhaps, absent himself somehow to spare them both the embarrassment. Disappointment washed over him, lifting tears to his eyes again, all of his anticipation overtaken by doubts. He leaned against the panel for a moment, before he turned to slump down on the floor in the soft lamplight. He tucked his knees to his chest, and wrapped his arms around them, knowing it would be only a matter of time before that pulse became pain, before the warmth became a raging inferno, before he would undeniably show he was something he had denied for years. Omegan. Hannibal spent a good chunk of time discussing the arrangements that Will had made for the families of the victims, and for the body of Mrs. Hobbs. He was pleasantly surprised to find that his mate had also sent copies of their wishes and a report of his findings to the magistrate's office while he was fighting to save Abigail's life. He was once again filled with delight in his husband, and looked forward to the teasing promise Will had made to chase his nightmares away. After the day they'd had, they both would need it. He moved toward the stairs with the vague intention of checking on Abigail, expecting he would find Will at her bedside, when he caught Will's sugary scent. Riding in a deeper tone to his fragrance was a faint trace of something that flooded his veins with sudden warmth. He'd been slowly becoming aware of that fevered sweetness for some time, but he hadn't understood what it was telling him until that moment, when it hit him with the equivalent of a slap to his hindbrain. Heat. His mate was ripening into his heat, and every nuance of that scent seemed to scream it. Hannibal tipped his head, Will's scent strengthening with every breath, the familiar sweetness overcome with feverish warmth, the missing note to the bouquet that was his mate's hallmark fragrance. The stronger it got, the harder his heart beat, the warmer he felt. He blamed it on primitive instincts of being an alpha, but it was more primal than primitive, a drive to find the source of what drew him in, to wrap that scent and its source in his own protective warmth and keep him safe. "My lord," Berger said, coming toward him with a hangdog expression of acute concern on his weathered face. "There's something Price says you need to know. It's his lordship, my lord." "I know," Hannibal said, swallowing hard, the tip of his tongue wetting his sudden dry lips. "I know what it is, Berger." "Price says he's up in your suite, my lord," Berger said, his concern intensifying. "He said to tell you that his lordship's skittish as a fawn, and you need to listen to him." "I always listen to him." Berger's meaning penetrated the haze of awareness Will's scent had wrapped him in. Concerned, he asked, "Berger, are you saying Will would prefer I don't join him?" "No, not that. He's just a mite scared, my lord," Berger said, wringing his hands. "The past waits on him every year for the way his memory works." "I'm aware of how his memory works, Berger. Trust me," Hannibal said, vast disappointment washing over him. "None of the servants bed down in the house?" Berger shook his head and Hannibal nodded. "Make up one of the empty rooms for me, just in case. Does he have everything he needs?" It was Berger's turn to nod. He looked on the cusp of tears, and Hannibal knew he was doing a poor job of hiding how deeply the outcome of Will's decision affected him. But it was his to choose. It was always his to choose, and the day Hannibal stopped respecting that was the day he would remove himself from Will entirely, a fitting exile for someone unworthy of Will's company. "Thank you, Berger," he said, turning to mount the stairs. "Please inform the staff to keep clear of our suite. I expect Mr. Price knows what's to be done." The door to his suite was a faint outline in the dark, the low lamplight within leaving a bare seam of light beneath. He moved to the door and gingerly tried the handle, which was locked. "Everything is prepared," Will said, his voice thin by the width of the door, but Hannibal could tell he was just there, perhaps like himself leaning his head against the wood. He lifted his hand and touched the panel, wishing he could reach Will as easily as he could open the door before him. But it wasn't that easy. Will wasn't that easy. "I know," he said, pitching his voice low. "Berger told me." There was a short silence, the soft brush of something against the door, followed by Will saying, "You don't have to stay, Hannibal. I'm not asking that of you." Hannibal frowned and closed his eyes, picturing Will there on the other side, small and poised and flush, ensuring that Hannibal could leave as quickly as possible with minimal trouble. Always thinking of others, always trying to save himself because he could not trust anyone to help him, or care for him, or need him enough to try to understand him. Hannibal trembled with the need to hold him, to chase away his doubts, to draw Will around him as surely as that scent and drive away every doubt from his curly-haired head. His nostrils flared as Will's scent strengthened. His lips parted, pulling the flavor across his teeth and tongue, tasting the burn that was his mate, the fire of it finer than any liqueur from anywhere in the world. It was uniquely Will, smoky with heat, with a sharp tang that made Hannibal reflexively swallow, mouth-watering, a balm to his very soul. He slowly slid down to sit on the floor next to the door, his back to the wall, elbows propped on his bent knees, and he waited. He listened to the soft sounds of the house around him, staff puttering about, getting dinner prepared. He listened to the slight shift of Will's trim body against the door, the faint sound of his breath. He imagined he could hear Will's heart beating, the rush of blood through his veins, pushing that heady scent to the surface. It seemed hours passed before Will's soft voice finally broke the stillness again. "You truly don't have to stay, Hannibal." Hannibal tipped his head back against the door frame. "You are my husband, Will. My place is with you." Will said nothing. Hannibal's thick alpha scent teased over his tongue like a caress, like a palm pressing down against the aching throb of his heat, for even such a slight relief. "Will, why are you hiding yourself from me?" "Because I'm a coward, Hannibal. I've come to value your opinion of me." The admission pained him, scalded him down to his core. Weakness, the simpering of an omega who couldn't stand to cross their alpha. "As I value your opinion of me," Hannibal said, head lolling against the wall. If he hadn't been straining to hear, he might not have heard Will speak at all, testament to the room's proofing for just this instance.
Will, why would you not tell me your heat was coming due?
Because it isn't due. I think perhaps being in such close company with you has turned things about a bit. I had hoped it would hold off, and then I could deal with it at Hartford without involving you.
Hannibal's face pulled taut in a spasm of displeasure. His voice was a husky purr that seemed to vibrate through the door when he asked, "You'd prefer not to involve me in your heat?"
"I would prefer not to involve either one of us. It is inconvenient and troublesome. I, unfortunately, cannot avoid it, but I needn't drag you into it. In a few days things can be as they were, and neither of us will see the other in a shameful state."
"A shameful state," Hannibal echoed, his heart sinking. He should have known Will would think such a thing, indoctrinated as he'd been by a vicious alpha, and baptized in Hannibal's own unwholesome opinions when he had been so terribly ignorant.
"Yes," Will said, sounding resolved when he was anything but. "Since your return things have been different between us. You treat me in such a way that I could never ask for better. You look at me and smile like I'm the most amazing thing you've ever seen."
Hannibal's brow furrowed. He leaned closer to the seam of the closed door, holding his breath to better hear his mate.
"I can't bear to see you look at me the way you did before you abandoned me. Hannibal, like I'm hateful, like I'm something that shouldn't exist. A construct of meager appeal, housing a vapid, empty mind and lack of true purpose outside of getting bedded."
Hannibal flinched, the sting in his heart matched only by the sting behind his closed lids.
"You want a partner in life, not something else that demands more of your attention than you can spare,"
Will said, hugging himself so hard it hurt, but no one could see it. No one would know how weak he let himself become. He could hide here, wait it out, and put it all behind him as he always did, with no one the wiser.
"What's happening between us in the last few weeks isn't something I'm willing to risk ruining with this ugliness. This will pass, and you will be glad that I acted in our best interests. I will not encumber you with my demands, Hannibal. I'm not what you thought I was, and I will not let you see me in a state that can only repulse you."
It cut deep into his heart to hear Will say such a thing, to know that his own words and actions had caused his mate to shroud himself from him, to shield them both from the potential of his response. "I cannot fault you for closing the door against me. Your entire life you've been coached to believe your instincts are flawed, that your nature will betray you, that your needs are inconvenient and your wants inconsequential. But what you have been taught is wrong, Will. Your instincts are flawless and your nature is unblemished. Your needs and your wants are my foremost desire to satisfy, as a man and as your mate. What has grown between us is genuine, and you know it as well as I do. Just as we both know I owe my fair share of the blame in influencing your decision, Will." It was Will's fear of having his happiness taken away that was driving him to retreat to a place where the truth wouldn't hurt him again, where he wasn't vulnerable. He needed to protect himself, and Hannibal needed to protect him. "I cannot imagine how I could ever have been so blind as to ever look at you in such a way," Hannibal whispered, his fingers running along the floorboard, finding the gap beneath the door, and curling up under it. He could feel the warmth of Will's body there, close enough to touch, but he made no move to do so. "I have no excuse to offer you for what I said to you, Will, nor for how I treated you. I remember every second of it."
"So do I,"
Will murmured, his gaze fixing on Hannibal's fingers there, curved up against the wood. Well-tended nails, long, fine fingers, every inch of him patrician, while Will was just Will. "Why did you come to me that night?" Hannibal asked. With his eyes closed he could imagine they were sitting together, perhaps in the garden at Hartford by moonlight, with no Matthew Brown or Mason Verger or Garrett Jacob Hobbs waiting to rip Will away from this world, with no conniving Mina making strife between them, just he and his mate, side by side in the night, and the sky lit up with stars like sparkling jewels above them.
"Grandfather insisted,"
Will whispered, shivering with remembered shame.
"He said I had to try. What else was I to do?"
"There was nothing else you could do," Hannibal breathed, gripping the bottom of the door tightly.
You were friendless in an unfamiliar place, and someone with more status, age, and wisdom than you instructed you to fling yourself on my mercy. I wish I had known."
"Would it have changed the outcome, Hannibal?" Will asked, wiping at his forehead. He could feel it gaining strength again, despite the oddly comforting suppression Hannibal's scent offered.
"I would like to think so. There is no way to know now. I thought you had schemed it on your own, desperate to secure your place. I imagined you had lived to that point, being told every minute of your life how beautiful you are, how lucky your alpha would be, how quickly and easily you would get whatever your heart desired just by crooking your little finger for it. I thought you armed as a knight in your confidence, Will, and I attacked it in my own, little knowing how one-sided a match it was."
Will swallowed against a lump in his throat, resisting those soft words and the memories of that night.
"I was determined to deny you everything I imagined you sought to take away from me. I built forts and dug moats and coiled about my hoard like a dragon. I wish I had known then what I know now. How different our lives would have been."
Will's head came up and he shivered, and he could not keep himself from asking, "What do you know now, Hannibal?"
That all you wanted was a place to call home. A place where you belong, a family that loves and respects you. Such a small thing to some, such a small thing to ask. It should never have been in question.
Will ground his wrist against his eyes, fighting the aching tears that threatened. With a soft, scornful laugh to cover his upset, he said, "It was too much to ask of a stranger, too much to hope for after all."
"The gods betrayed you to my hands. I stood you in place of one beyond my reach, and I burned you in her stead. You paid the price for my ignorance just as you did for your father. I have promised you I would make it up to you, Will. I have promised I will dedicate my life to you, and you will know as well as I do that our attachment is no small thing."
Will wiped at his face, half sweat, half tears.
"If it takes the rest of my life, I will never stop trying, Will. You have a place to belong, Will. You have a home. Your place is with me, and our home is one another. The family that loves and respects you is ours together."
Will blinked rapidly, head falling back against the door, Hannibal's words resonating within him as surely as the bond.
"Every part of you is precious to me, Will. Every aspect of you is the treasure I hoard,"
Hannibal said, reaching for Will with something less tangible than touch, but no less powerful.
"When I touch you, I do so from my honest desire to feel you with my senses, to satisfy my greed for everything about you."
Tears rolled down Will's face, the fluttering in his heart swelling up to choke him.
"What has sprung to life between us is not the machinations of nature, Will,"
Hannibal said, insistent that Will would not mistake him.
"Neither one of us would ever be led about by our nose against our will. We are far too stubborn for it. To dismiss it as such is to tarnish the truth of it."
"And what truth is that?" Will asked, the thickness in his voice making Hannibal's eyes mist in response, the ache to hold him and soothe him almost stealing his breath.
"That I care for you, deeply so. That we touch because we are drawn together, pulled to each other through mutual fascination and regard. There is nothing about you which could ever dissuade me from wanting to spend every moment the gods grant me with you, Will, even to my last breath."
Will took a breath in the silence, trembling. He wiped his face, feeling Hannibal's honesty through his bond. He searched in vain for any sign that his heat was clouding his thinking, but found none. What was happening simply was, as Jimmy had tried to tell him.
"It is always yours to choose, Will,"
Hannibal said, his husky voice strained with emotion.
"If you tell me to go, I will go. If you allow me to stay, I will stay, Will. To share this moment with you, to discover together the beauty of its promise, it is more than I deserve, considering how I have treated you in the past. You should have a far better man as your mate, Will, but I will give you everything in me, without hesitation."
"Why should you, Hannibal?" Will asked, heart skipping in his chest, the remnants of his crumbling resistance prompting him to ask. "Pity?"
"No, never,"
Will said, almost before the word left Will's lips.
"Tribute? There is an altar at your feet that has lain bare too long."
Will flinched, taking a breath that caught at the edges where everything wavered and trembled so dangerously.
"I have done unspeakable things to you, Will, through no fault of your own. It would be a good start to begin by making an offering."
Will frowned, the husky timbre of Hannibal's voice vibrating down his spine to the pit of his stomach, a soft spread of warmth that teased at his heat.
"Are you thumbing your nose at fate, Hannibal?"
"I believe for the first time in my life, Will, I am offering to embrace it,"
Hannibal said, straining for any reaction from the other side of that closed door. Softly, cautiously, he ventured.
"What does your heart desire, Will?"
Will was silent for a long moment, weighing that moment against his uncertain future, against his unkind past, and the hope that would always cripple him with promises it would never keep, ever, however sweet the present had been.
"I want to see you, Hannibal,"
he murmured, straining to blame it on his heat, but knowing that was only an excuse, a ready explanation for decisions he was too nervous to claim responsibility for.
"I want you to see me."
He trembled in the wake of it, breathless and braced for his father to be right after all, for his fears to be realized, for that happiness he yearned for to be snatched from him the moment he dared to reach, always the moment he dared to reach.
Past the hard edges of a child taught from the cradle that he birthed his own misfortune. Through the mirror of your empathy and the armor of your determination to find the man within.
"I am neither a man,"
Will said, his hand falling, reaching, hovering over Hannibal's lax fingers.
"nor a woman. I am only myself. I want you to see me as I am, however ugly it may be, and still say I am your treasure, your reason for being."
Hannibal stilled, feeling the faint brush of Will's fingers over his own, a touch charged with purpose, with hesitance, with hope.
"You will always be my reason for being, Will. All I ever ask is that you are yourself. What you fear I will find ugly, I can assure you I will find indescribably beautiful, as every part of you is beautiful to me,"
Hannibal said, breath hitching when those warm, gentle fingertips touched his own, softly, faintly, a cobweb of sensation, the tickle of a butterfly's wings.
"May I see you, Will?"
Will traced the tips of Hannibal's fingers, considering his slumberous heat stretching within him. His answer was pulled from his lips like caramel, sticky and sweet.
"Yes."
"Then unlock the door."